Hey, welcome back, everyone. So, back in the old home office again, and some big stories to go over tonight. We're talking about how the FBI was spying on both Trump and on Giuliani, apparently, according to the information we have right now. During the time when Trump was being impeached by the House and Senate Democrats, attempted impeachment in the Senate, successful in the House. We're going to go to that story tonight, talk about the context of that, also some of the, say, overreach in general lately when it comes to FBI spying on Americans, and also the significance of what it means if the FBI was in fact spying on Giuliani during that time and Trump. Also going to be going into the Chinese Communist Party's plan to control the global internet. Actually, something I've been warning about for a while. Do you all remember a long time ago, a few years back, where everyone was saying, oh, America's going to relinquish control of the internet? It had to do with ICANN, right? A lot of media said, no, ICANN doesn't control anything significant other than the names of websites. And then if you were following my stories at the time, I said, actually, this is a lot of disinformation because underneath ICANN is IANA, which, if that were to be controlled, for example, by the United Nations, would mean that pretty much any country, if they're able to gain significant influence over these institutions, would be able to control the global internet. And now we see that as the United States relinquished its control of the internet, meaning the internet is no longer under U.S. jurisdiction. The internet is no longer held, under U.S. jurisdiction. The internet is no longer something, say, held to the standards of the Constitution. And instead, now it's an international institution, essentially, that can be influenced by just about anybody. And what happens? The Chinese Communist Party begins plotting, we're going to be going over some of their exact quotes, and drawing up a plan to control not just the Chinese internet, but the global internet. And something we may already be seeing when it comes to their influence over institutions, over journalists, over advocacy groups, over academics, and over some politicians, pulling the strings behind these things. We're going to be going over this. Now, folks, that said, good to see you all as always. And Susie Q, I appreciate it. Yeah, thanks for being here. Yeah, Debbie Worth, thanks for being here. Everyone, thanks for being here. Now, folks, as always, if you have questions, leave them in the chat, and we'll try to get to them. That said, let's jump into the first story for the night. And so here we have FBI spied on Trump and Giuliani. It says here, Epoch Times reports, FBI spied on Giuliani, Trump iCloud communications during impeachment push, according to Giuliani, but according to information he has. Let's go into this. Now, a bit of background. I'm sure you all saw the story recently, or maybe you didn't, that Giuliani's office was raided by federal agents, and they took from him several electronic devices. Allegedly, this has to do with, maybe not registering as a foreign agent while dealing with Ukraine is the apparent reason they're giving for it. But the evidence for this isn't quite lining up in terms of, let's say, proof of let's say, justifiable search and seizure, which is what this was. It appears to not have been done through legal means, number two. And number three, also, this seems to show some serious hypocrisy within our institutions. And even more so now, we have it coming out that Giuliani and Trump may have been spied on during this time as well. Let's go into it. It says here, former New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani, also Trump's main lawyer, said that the FBI surveilled his and former President Donald Trump's iCloud chats during impeachment hearings in 2019. In other words, before this recent search and seizure happened, while Trump was still president, Trump may have been spied on by the FBI while he was still president. It says, and this is right ahead of the elections as well. Keep that in mind. That's in context of the 2020 elections, the FBI spying on him. It says here, in an interview over the weekend, Giuliani, whose home was searched by federal agents last week, said that his lawyer, Robert Costello, was told by the U.S. Attorney's Office in Manhattan that the alleged wiretapping took place. And he said this is according to Giuliani. He said, quote, he asked the prosecutor to repeat it because he couldn't believe it was true. He told this to WABC Radio in New York. And he continued, this is Giuliani speaking again. He said, quote, to me, they just trashed the president of the United States. Now on this, when House Democrats launched their impeachment query against Trump over his phone call with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, Giuliani, who had been Trump's personal attorney, said he was communicating with the president. And Giuliani said this, quote, meanwhile, the Justice Department, while I'm defending him on that with others, invaded my iCloud. He says, I can't fathom that would be done to an ordinary citizen. The president doesn't have any more rights than anybody else, but he doesn't have less rights. To me, they just trashed the president of the United States like he has no constitutional rights. And keep in mind, folks, on that, in context of this, normally there are attorney-client privileges, right? Normally, under normal systems of law, there's attorney-client privileges. There's certain communications between you and your lawyer, if you need a lawyer, that can't really be made public, that can't be seized by the government, especially when the basis of this is you making legal cases to defend yourself against an ongoing investigation or something else. Normally, that's outside of it, right? Also, what does the Constitution say? You're technically protected, against illegal searches and seizures. And if this violated attorney-client privileges, that may have been an illegal search and seizure, at least seizure of information. But again, this goes back to even 2016 when the FBI was spying on Trump, spying on different officials, when the media said it was a big conspiracy, but the evidence came out and showed otherwise. And also, when it comes to the data they collect as well, sometimes public officials can gain access to that data depending on how it is done. Meaning that, well, again, I have to see what evidence comes out from this. We'll have to see what information comes out from this. But this may go far beyond just to the FBI, because that's what we saw back in 2016. Remember, folks, and there was a Trump-Russia scandal, right? The one that actually didn't happen, but the media made it sound like it happened. And evidence really came out only towards the end of Trump's term, showing that it never actually happened, the whole Trump-Russia scandal. When it turned out that the entire dossier they used, right, the Trump-Russia dossier, had actually been financed by the Democratic Party and the Clinton campaign. And again, that document was based on sources from Russian sources collected by a former British spy hired by them that he never actually verified. In other words, the document itself, claiming that Trump colluded with the Russians, was itself actually based on Russian disinformation, never vetted, never proven, provided to different public officials, provided to the media, provided to even federal agencies, and used first off to try to prevent Trump from becoming president, right? Literally what they accused him of doing, involvement of public officials who were involved in the spying process that they used the document to get those powers with, and then again tried to challenge his presidency for the entire 4 years he was in. Remember, folks, the same way that happened mirrors in some ways what's happening now, right? Again, the use of this Ukrainian scandal, one which, again, the evidence does not support the claims with that, right? The evidence, the actual evidence does not support the claims of it, although they did use, Trump's phone call with the Ukrainian president to try to impeach him. And now we're seeing that the FBI may have done something illegal, spying on Trump during this time and spying on his lawyer during this time, based around that scandal, based around those rumors. Now, let's go into this a bit more. Now, elaborating on this, Giuliani said that he carried out a number of conversations with the president that could ostensibly be retrieved from the Apple-based system that backs up emails, text messages, photos, documents, and much more. Those of you who don't have an iPhone, typically your iPhone comes with an iCloud account. And what it does is backs up your data. So if you take photos on your iPhone, whatever photos you're taking pictures of, right, on your iPhone, if it's backed up on iCloud, unless you turn off that feature, those things are on your iCloud account. Your contacts, your text messages, right, your text messages, documents you might have, emails you might have, anything that you're saving on your phone, a lot of things, will be backed up automatically on your iCloud account, unless you turn it off. And that means if the FBI was monitoring Giuliani's iCloud account, It was monitoring his photographs, his emails, his text messages, his communications, possibly, it seems here, well, very likely it seems here, with the President of the United States himself. The FBI was accessing that, if this is true. Based on the information that's coming out right now, it does seem to be the case. We'll have to see what evidence comes out from this. Let's go into it a bit more. Giuliani said this, quote, "Unless these people have no ethics or any sense of what it means to be a lawyer, what do you do when you do that? People who listen to this now say, how can I trust talking to my lawyer?" And he continues saying, quote, "The government may come in and start listening to it, or it might try to see text or memoranda." And what he's suggesting here is, again, the attorney-client privileges. Normally, if you're talking to your lawyer, the government can't monitor your conversations with your lawyer when you're talking to a lawyer on how to defend yourself in another case. In other words, not only did they trump up charges against Trump in order to try to impeach him, one, in the impeachment process itself, didn't follow normal protocol, right? They bypassed key processes for it. They rushed it through. It was presided over not by the Chief Justice, Justice Roberts at the time, but instead by the Democrats themselves, and again was voted on along party lines, right? It didn't work. It didn't work as things normally function. And while they were doing that to him, somebody had the FBI go and investigate him and monitor his communications with his lawyer and his attempts to deal with the case against him. And again, Giuliani's raising the question here. Now, this is Trump, and, like Trump or not, whatever your political positions are, fine. But this is an individual with the same rights, the same legal rights as you and I, who was being monitored by the FBI while he was communicating with his lawyer during an investigation into him, which was a bit funky in itself. But the important point here is attorney-client privileges that may have been violated by a federal agency during this time. Now, the Epoch Times contacted the Department of Justice for comment. We did not get a comment from them. Last week, after agents searched his home, Giuliani's home, and confiscated several electronic devices, the former mayor, Giuliani, disputed allegations that he represented a foreign national. And he said this, "I never represented a Ukrainian national or official before the United States government." And this is, again, based on what he's accused of. He says, "I've declined it several times. I've had contacts in countries like Ukraine, and the contract is a clause that says I will not engage in lobbying or foreign representation." Sorry, he said, "I have contracts, not contacts." He says, "I don't do it because I felt it would be too compromising." Now, Giuliani also told Tucker Carlson on Fox News on April 29th that DOJ officials, told that to Tucker Carlson. We also reached out to the Department of Justice on that. We have not yet heard back from them. They did not comment on it. And stepping back a little bit on the history of this, right? In late 2019, amid the first House impeachment inquiry against Trump about a conversation he had with Ukraine's president in July of that year, prosecutors charged two alleged former associates to Giuliani. Those were Lev Parnas and Igor Fruman. With unrelented crimes regarding alleged campaign-financed violations. And Giuliani had legally represented Parnas. Now, on this, let's go into some context on this, because we see this happening. Let's go into a bit of what's actually happening right now with it. Now, Alan Dershowitz said this, "The FBI's raid of Giuliani is unconstitutional." Epoch Times reports. It says the FBI's recent raid on an apartment owned by Rudy Giuliani, a lawyer for former President Donald Trump, violated the Constitution. And this is according to constitutional expert Alan Dershowitz. And he said, quote, This was just a misuse of the search and seizure power," as I just mentioned a bit. He continued saying this, "Initially it was turned down. Now it was approved, both by a judge and by the Attorney General of the United States. So it wasn't lawless action." In other words, it was approved, so you can't say it was lawless. But he says, quote, "But I believe that they acted inconsistently with both the spirit and the letter of the Constitution, and that there should be remedies for it." Now, Dershowitz said this on Newsmax on Saturday, yesterday. He continues saying, quote, "It should be done through subpoena," meaning search and seizure like this. It should be done through subpoena. And that is the constitutional route to getting evidence. Now, a search warrant, a bit of background on this, a search warrant being executed points to officials believing the subject would destroy evidence if the search was not carried out. But the lawyer knew that he was being investigated for months, so there's no basis for a search unless a subpoena was obtained. And this is what Dershowitz was arguing. He said, quote, "The Fourth Amendment demands a subpoena in these actions, not a search warrant. What they did in this case was unconstitutional." And folks, this is coming out as well where we've seen, for example, the emails and different documents from Hunter Biden may have, again, done very similar things that Giuliani's accused of doing, and we see nothing really happening on that. Although there do seem to be investigations, right? They're not violating the Constitution. Instead of getting a subpoena, actually doing a search and seizure, right? Getting a search warrant, search and seizure of his premise. We also see this happening before. Roger Stone. Everyone remember when Roger Stone had like the pre-dawn raid of his home, right? Again, for like very minor charges. Anyone remember when, for example, Steve Bannon was on this, Chinese billionaire ship that he, again, runs Guo Media, and he does a show, through. When he was on this ship, and again, he was accused of mishandling funds for the Build the Wall program that he was part of, like a Kickstarter campaign thing or a GoFundMe campaign, I can't remember which. And they send like the special forces of the mailmen to go get him. I mean, who knew even that the U.S. Postal Service had a law enforcement branch, let alone one that could send like speedboats to come and arrest you, right? I mean, this was, again, the types of overuse of power seemingly to be used against people with no real basis for, right? We never see other people outside the political realm being taken on with this much force, right? Pre-dawn raids, speedboat arrests, this type of thing for very minor crimes, technically. This is what we've been seeing, right? Now, again, with Giuliani, this seems to be the case as well. But on the note of the FBI, this is important as well. Another story here from a few days ago, but I think it fits in with this context, and it's important to know because, right, like Trump or don't like Trump, right? He's an individual, an American citizen with the same types of legal protections as you and I. And if the FBI is violating his rights, well, this could have a spillover effect as well, right? If they would do it to the president of the United States, this is something that should be reined in if it was illegal. And let's go into what they're doing with the rest of the country now, because here's another story. It says here, FBI abused secretive surveillance program, according to a court. And it says here, the FBI has continued its abuses of the secretive Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, FISA program, including searching for information on U.S. citizens who had gone to the Bureau to report that they were victims of a crime, a newly declassified document shows. In other words, folks, this type of illegal search, this is a type of illegal monitoring, and if you consider taking electronic data seizure, that's a legal search and seizure as well, powers they gave themselves, which they've overstepped, and they're now using against citizens without really having a legal basis for doing it, possibly. Let's go into a bit more. It says here, one FBI information specialist between April 11th, 2019 and July 8th, 2019 conducted approximately 124 queries of email messages and other electronic communications obtained through secretive methods under the FISA program, which permits warrantless surveillance of foreigners outside of the United States, right? Typically foreigners, but it affects Americans because they have a process through which if you're an individual and you're contacting your cousin in Mexico or your friend in Canada or your relative in part of Europe, and they can monitor that individual and through that individual monitor you. This is some of the actions we saw during the 2016 scandal when, again, the FBI was abusing FISA powers against Trump and his associates. It says here, right, going a bit more into it. It says the surveillance can and has been used to ultimately obtain information on Americans, as I mentioned. It says here, the searches included looking at information for people who had requested to participate in a bureau-run Citizens Academy run by the FBI, which is a program for local leaders designed to foster greater understanding of the role of federal law enforcement and people who needed to enter the field office the FBI worker was based in to conduct work such as a repair. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court reported in the newly released document. In other cases, people who entered the field office, which wasn't identified, to report they were victims of a crime were subjected to the background search. And this means, folks, that if you were to go to the FBI with information, you have concerns or so on, if you're a repair guy and you go there to do work, they might read your emails. They might use this to overstep some of their technical legal boundaries, although you could argue whether they could do it legally or not. They could overstep some of these powers, right? Let's say stretch some of these powers to read your emails, to monitor you. Now, as someone like myself, I've been covering Chinese espionage now since 2008. I can say that's kind of justified because I know, for example, that the Chinese Communist Party and foreign governments, not just China, but other foreign governments, they do tend to weaponize, repairmen for like HVAC systems, like your air conditioner system. They do tend to weaponize things like the repair guys for your, office scanner, because the office scanner is going to process all the documents you're printing. They do that, and they do weaponize these things for espionage purposes. They do this, and any device such as a printer or so on, which is connected to the company Wi-Fi, can work as let's say, a break point. It can work as kind of a stepping stone to breach the broader network. And so, people who do this type of work, right, when it comes to spies and so on, it's not unheard of that they will weaponize repair guys and so on going into government offices in order to spy on people or plant bugs and things like this. And so, in my opinion, my analysis, it's not totally unjustified for them to be doing that. The concern, at least when it comes to, again, people engaging with them directly, the concern here, though, is if they're abusing FISA powers, because this, again, the FISA powers, which is, again, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, was what they were abusing when they were using it against Trump and his associates during the 2016 elections. And if we see here again that they're abusing other surveillance powers, such as monitoring Giuliani and monitoring Trump's communications while Trump was president of the United States, this does show some pretty serious, I don't know if we could call it abuses of power, because the FBI is working as the arm of government in this case, right? Government using the weapons which we have given them, essentially against private citizens and against the president of the United States. In this case, it's not clear who did it. But we see this happening, folks, right? We see this abuse. We see this expanding technical ability of our intelligence agencies. And we see this being used in ways that they were not intended to be used, justified or not. We do see these things being used in ways that they were not intended to be used. The concern then is, what else could they be used for? And if we go back again to 2016 and the whole Trump-Russia investigation and the way the FISA courts were seriously abused with this, we do have something to go on with this, on what it could mean going forward. And, folks, they tend to support things when they support their own political interests. Who's to say Republicans won't do it against Democrats in the future? Who's to say a new government won't come in and use it against individuals who might support it right now, but when you're a target of it, right? If it runs away, if things happen like that, maybe it'll reach beyond the current realm in which people support it right now. Because again, typically people will tend to allow things when it supports their own political interests, legal or not, overreaching or not. The problem is what it could lead to, right? What this could become if it is allowed to continue, if these powers are not reined in. And if they're abusing powers, we could hope at least something will at least be done about it. Now, I want to get into some questions in a bit, but before we get into that, I want to go into this China story, because there's some pretty big things happening right now with the. Actually, I'll go over. We'll break up the questions tonight because I want to go in a long segment on the Chinese internet. So how about this? Let's go over some questions first. And folks, if you have more questions, please leave them in the chat. I'll try to get to them. We'll go over a few questions first. I'm going to go into this issue of China. We got leaked documents showing the Chinese Communist Party is plotting and even making statements on it to take over the global internet. We have information on how they're planning on doing it, the methods they're planning on using. I'll be telling you a bit of background on this. We'll go into that in just a minute. But first, let's go over a few questions. And then after that China segment, we'll go into a few more questions. So if you have questions, again, leave them in the chat. I'll try to get to them. First off is from the one and only Pinky. You say, Josh, can you talk about Xi wanting to rule the internet around the world? Okay, well, I'm going to get into that in just a minute. So give me a minute. We'll talk about that. Just briefly on that, though, is maybe not based on what we're going to go into in a minute, but the strategy behind that we can go into. Information control is a military program of the Chinese Communist Party. They call it the three warfares. That's the technical term for it, the three warfares. This is adopted into the Chinese Communist Party's military code. And the three warfares are psychological warfare, media warfare, and legal warfare. Psychological warfare is not necessarily false information. Psychological warfare is altering the conclusion that you come to while looking at a set of information. So, for example, when the Chinese Communist Party, persecutes its own people, when it has slave labor in Xinjiang, when it has, organ harvesting of Falun Gong practitioners, when it's burning down the temples of Tibetan monks, when it's overtaking Hong Kong and ending their system of democracy, ending the one country, two systems agreement, when it's threatening forceful takeover of Taiwan. And people look at that and say, well, sure, they have slave labor and sure, there's all these things happening there. But, who are we to criticize them? Because they say that, criticizing the Chinese Communist Party for its extreme abuses, right? 50 to 70 million people killed under Mao Zedong. When you criticize the Chinese Communist Party for that, it actually hurts their feelings. This is the literal thing that they give out. They call it the century of humiliation, right? When the rest of the world, Britain was waging the Opium War on China and so on. China was losing wars. The Qing dynasty collapsed and so on, right? When they talk about these things, they say it's the century of humiliation. And when you criticize the Chinese Communist Party for its extreme human rights abuses, that actually hurts the feelings of the Chinese people, which in that context means it makes the Chinese Communist Party look bad. In other words, they try to combine the identity of the Communist Party, which is the greatest abuser of the Chinese people probably in history, right? Merging the identity of the Chinese Communist Party, which destroyed the Chinese culture under the Cultural Revolution, which destroyed their religious foundations, which destroyed the cultural heritage of the country, that somehow represents the Chinese people, right? That's the analysis they give. And that's the analysis they teach to our military leaders. That's the analysis being taught at U.S. universities. That's the analysis being told by a lot of, quote unquote academics, giving quotes to different mainstream news outlets and writing articles and so on. That's the common analysis. And that is a psychological warfare narrative from the Chinese Communist Party meant to change the perception, the conclusion you come to when looking at the same set of information. In this case, looking at the extreme abuses of the Chinese people, this academic analysis, psychological warfare narrative the CCP is pushing justifies that through the CCP's excuse for it, even though if you knew your history, it doesn't make sense. Psychological warfare, right? That's one part of it. The other one is media warfare, the control of all outlets of information, not just news outlets, not just social media outlets, but any kind of outlet of information. Your ability to chat with friends on, WeChat, your ability to have private message conversations on your text, your ability to, for example, debate things in forums, any kind of outlet of information, news reports, TV reports, documentaries, the control of films, any kind of outlet where people could receive information on a large scale. That would fall under media warfare. And legal warfare, the last of these, would be manipulation of the international courts. They call it lawfare as well. We saw them use this, for example, in the South China Sea, where the Chinese Communist Party fabricated documents claiming that they had historical ownership of the South China Sea, and then locked up the diplomatic and even in some cases military debate around the ownership of the South China Sea, locked it up in the courts while they still carried out the building of islands and so on. In other words, they used the legal tool to distract people and to keep the conflict locked in the courts rather than in the waters, right? And while they had it locked up in the courts, they were able to go and build their islands, weaponize those islands, militarize those islands, and then establish controlled regions around those islands, right? Lawfare, legal warfare. Now, when it comes to information control, why does the CCP do this? The same reason they have the Great Firewall, which is their internet control system. The same reason they have the 50-cent army, which is their paid internet trolls. The same reason they try to control Western institutions, media outlets, journalists, academics, right? Even nonprofit organizations that they can hire as tools to try to, attack their enemies and defend their own interests. They do it in the United States. I mentioned several times some of the articles from National Pulse. An investigative reporter there, Natalie Winters, has a lot of articles on this, specifically under the CETC, which is under the United Front Work Department, which is the Chinese Communist Party's branch that carries out these types of operations. And keep in mind that the United Front Work Department, a government branch working on this, also works with the General Political Department Liaison Department, which has since been restructured under a different branch, I think the Strategic Support Force. But the liaison department of the General Political Department was the political war-fighting branch of the Chinese Communist Party, working hand in hand with the same institution, the United Front, using its front organizations like CETC, openly listed in FARA documents, Foreign Agents Registration Act documents here in the United States, working with American academics, American journalists, American politicians, and others, including giving them paid dinners and so on, including taking them on trips and so on, including giving them other benefits, and we can watch these people's reports and see how that influence campaign through the Chinese Communist Party, in fact, altered the type of reporting we saw coming out from these individuals. In other words, many academics in the United States, many news outlets in the United States, many nonprofits in the United States, and other political advocacy organizations, right, that you can read articles of them defending the CCP and attacking the enemies of the CCP, are oftentimes working through United Front organizations, meaning they're not only working with the Chinese Communist Party, but through information programs tied to the Chinese military, because the United Front works with the Chinese military on this. And so, folks, this is the bigger picture of what the CCP is doing to us. Not just the United States, just about every country. They do this in Canada, they do this in Australia, they do this in Europe, they do it through all of Asia, they do it in India, they do it in most of Africa, most of Latin America. This is how the CCP does these types of programs everywhere. But here, of course, we're talking about in context some of the documents we've had and the documents we've exposed here in the United States. Yeah, so next time you folks read these articles of people defending the Chinese Communist Party while attacking the enemies of the Communist Party here in the United States or elsewhere, you can get a good sense of maybe what's behind it. Next question here is from, and I'll go into that story too, that we have these leaked documents talking about how Xi is actually planning, Xi Jinping, the head of the Chinese Communist Party, is planning and even has some public speeches that we can tie to this, planning to overtake the global internet, not just in China, not just the United States, but global internet, and how they're planning to do it. But first, a few more questions. This is from Jason Everest. He said, Josh, does John Durham exist? And if so, where is he? I think we're all wondering the same thing right about now. In fact, Trump himself was questioning this. Now, remember, folks, Durham, the Durham report we've been waiting for. John Durham was the individual brought on by the Department of Justice under Trump, when Trump was still in office. John Durham was brought on to investigate the whole Trump-Russia scandal, investigate especially the illegal spying on the Trump team that took place, that we can prove, during 2016 and beyond. John Durham was supposed to also release his report, which we never saw. And then we found out that John Durham was brought on also as special counsel, meaning that he has ability to recommend prosecution. And he's still in place, supposedly. John Durham is still in place, supposedly, as a special counsel, and may have some abilities, right, powers he could use for that, going after many Obama-era politicians who might have been part of the Trump-Russia scandal or any other course of investigation that might have led to by now. Now, keep in mind that Biden was the vice president under Obama, and that could be, pretty bad for him if that information were to come out, depending on what it is. But nobody knows where John Durham is right now. Nobody's heard anything from John Durham. Trump himself actually wrote something public not too long ago, basically saying, where is John Durham? Is he even alive? Is he even a real person? And so, folks, yeah, we haven't heard anything on John Durham other than that we know he has special counsel, prosecutorial abilities to an extent, and that he's launching this investigation still, supposedly, and maybe something's happening, but we have no idea. Next up is Mark Walsh. He said, what is your thought on the anticipated inflation we are facing? So the Biden administration, after a very short amount of time in office, is already spending upwards of $6 trillion of your money. And that's around 4 times the federal budget. And they're saying they want to pay for it by increasing taxes on wealthy Americans. We'll have to see where they actually put that bracket and whether that affects as well not only wealthy Americans, quote unquote, but also, let's say middle-class Americans as well. We'll have to see where they actually put the bracket at. Now, one of the big issues you have with taxing wealthy Americans is most wealthy Americans that would fit in that area tend to be business owners who could easily put their businesses outside the United States. And so a lot of officials are saying this is not only going to not work, but anybody who makes any significant amount of money is going to try to get their money out of the United States as soon as possible. The Biden administration is trying to get around that by getting any country they can aligned with the United States to enforce the same type of tax policy against businesses, corporations in this case, that the U.S. is enforcing, meaning the companies will have no place to go, meaning no matter where they go, they'll still be held basically to the same taxes. Now, could Biden force China to have the same taxes? Could he force Russia to have the same taxes? Could he force most of Africa or Latin America to have the same taxes? Probably not. But he could do this to maybe some European allies and so on, depending. We'll have to see. It might not work. And keep in mind, folks, a corporation isn't always a big company. A corporation could be your mom and pop store down the street. It could be your local barber shop. It could be your local, taqueria or something like that. People sometimes incorporate. I mean, if you run a business, typically you incorporate it, even if it's a small business, because the incorporation process gives you legal protections that you need as kind of a legal shield. And so increasing taxes on corporations in that case doesn't just affect the big guys, it affects the little guys as well. And he's talking about, again, financing this not just by the corporate tax, but also by a tax on wealthy Americans. We'll have to see how that works out. A few things that could happen. One is wealthy Americans leave the country. 2 is wealthy Americans put their businesses or money outside the country. Number 3 is, Biden extends powers globally somehow, and we have a globalist dictatorship of some kind where they're able to have a certain tax system that is enforced globally. The chances of them doing that globally, I would say, are very low, but we'll have to see. I'm sure they get some countries to sign on to it, meaning that it's probably not going to work. They're not going to, and maybe, even if they do get it to work, it destroys the incentive of becoming wealthy. Right? It destroys the incentive of becoming wealthy. If they want to have equal outcome, regardless of the effort you put in as an individual, which is what they're talking about now, equity, right? No matter how much work you do, no matter if you work 80 hours a week versus 20 hours a week, you should have the same outcome somehow. And if you have a different outcome of the work you put in, then somehow it's the system that's broken, not a result of, the work you're putting in somehow being flawed or better than someone else's, right? Equity. That's where it's heading. A way of flattening society, destroying the interest or incentive of putting in the effort to rise above the standards that everyone else is within. We'll have to see what happens with it. But regardless of all that, regardless of how it works, regardless of how they pay for it, regardless of whether that does what they said it's going to do, they're already now saying that we're very likely going to see inflation. And on that, they're saying it now, right? First, they were saying there's not going to be any inflation. It's not going to happen. When you spend $6 trillion, you're probably going to see inflation, right? Just basic economics would tell you this. And now they're admitting it, that we're going to see inflation. We'll have to see how severe the inflation is. Typically, the Federal Reserve can step in, lower interest rates a bit to take on some of that heat. The U.S. is already reeling right now from the impact of the lockdowns across the whole country, where businesses have been locked down. We're already reeling from the massive spending, not just in the under Biden, but even under Trump, when he had the bailouts take place. Was it $1.6 billion take place around that? We're already reeling from this economically, right? And so if in addition to all of that, they hit you with inflation, they hit you with more taxes for businesses which were already struggling, many of them because of the lockdowns, you can expect inflation. This is basic economics. And I mentioned too, normally the Federal Reserve would try to step in, which is one of the reasons that they do this, right? One of the reasons that it technically exists. Is to basically mitigate economic crashes, which it's never really successfully done. Typically it does the opposite. Typically it causes crashes, or at least it has a significant role in creating crashes, let's say. Typically they raise interest rates, you're going to have a boom. They lower interest rates, you're going to have a bust, a crash. They already lowered interest rates, right? I'm sorry, typically when they raise it, you have a crash, and typically when they lower it, you have a boom. They've already lowered interest rates to almost zero, meaning the buffer is almost non-existent right now, meaning they can't turn it down anymore, right? They can't turn it down anymore. And so that buffer is almost already gone. That buffer between where we stand now and facing economic collapse, essentially, right? Economic crash, basically. That buffer is gone, almost. And yeah, if they're spending $6 trillion with a pretty flimsy plan on how to pay for it, yeah, we can expect pretty serious economic problems. Now, I've mentioned a few times, hey, maybe gold or silver is a good investment because it's usually immune to these types of things to an extent. I'd say it again. But on top of that, the other big picture right now is the Chinese Communist Party is waging currency war on the United States. Chinese Communist Party is waging currency war on the United States. Right, I'll go into the internet in a bit. The China controlling the internet a bit. They're waging currency war on the United States with this digital yuan, this digital currency. And if the Chinese Communist Party can make the Chinese digital currency, the yuan, under the People's Bank of China, meaning the government controls it, the system of currency validated, even if not in the United States and just about everywhere else outside of the United States, and any business that chooses to use these. Remember, folks, already big corporations in the US are using Alipay, Alibaba's payment service. It's not far-fetched that the CCP may do that. If the Chinese Communist Party does that while the US is facing inflation and on the decline, and anybody who has assets in the US dollar is facing economic penalties, right, feeling the weight of it because of bad spending here in the US, the chances of them moving to a different currency, which is promising to be more stable because the CCP can regulate it and say it's worth whatever they want, they're probably going to do it. And if that happens, yes, not only are you going to see the normal possible inflation here in the US that we can be expecting, but something much more serious, because if that happens, all that debt on the US dollar, all those loans in the US dollar, all these other things, they're going to come crashing down around us. The timing on this couldn't, in my analysis, the timing on this could not be worse. Because again, this happens right as the CCP is rolling that out. And again, $6 trillion, 4 times the US budget, the US federal budget. That's not a minor thing, folks. All right, that said, let's go quick into a quick promo. I've been mentioning Epoch TV for a while. Folks, if you really want to support Crossroads, if you really want to help our mission of getting honest news out there, news that cannot be censored, please check out Epoch TV, epochtv.com. You can also now find my particular channel on it, which ties into the whole one, at joshphilipp.com, Philipp, which is part of Epoch TV as well. Either of these folks, they're both tied together. But either of these, support us in Epoch TV. This is the future of Crossroads, the future of Epoch Times video. As we're being censored, demonetized, and so on by YouTube, this is the future, we believe, of uncensored video news. And so here's a quick trailer showing you what we have in store.
This is revolutionary. This is Maoist. What Biden is doing is using race as a way of breaking down the existing power structures in the military. What they want to create is a military that is loyal to the new regime, that is loyal to the new socialist America. There's two purposes: A, to create a force that's loyal to a socialist America, and B, to so weaken the military that we can no longer stand up to China and Russia and play people like that. So with the police, they're doing the same thing. That's what I would do if I was a revolutionary. If Lenin was in the White House right now, or Mao Zedong was in the White House right now, that's what they would be doing.
All right, folks. Well, I went a bit long on the questions again. So let's jump now into the other story I was talking to you about, how China, the Chinese Communist Party, is planning to overtake the global internet. Now, the Epoch Times has leaked documents which detail this, and we recently had a big report explaining what's in there. Let's jump into that now. Epoch Times reports this: Chinese leader Xi Jinping lays out plan to control the global internet, according to leaked documents. It says here, Chinese leader Xi Jinping personally directed the communist regime, the Chinese Communist Party, to focus its efforts to control the global internet, displacing the influential role of the United States, according to internal documents recently obtained by the Epoch Times. In a January 2017 speech, which was around the time when the U.S. relinquished control of ICANN, or at least we're talking about it, well, a bit earlier technically, right? Earlier technically, but when the weight of this was coming down, let's say, Xi said the power, I think that was around, it was a bit earlier, but again, the fallout of it was hitting around then. Now, Xi said the, quote, power to control the internet had become the, quote, new focal point of China's national strategic contest. In other words, the strategy of the CCP, the national strategy of the CCP, had shifted by 2017 to control the global internet, to, take it from the hands of the United States, right? And it says here, right? And he singled out the United States as a rival force standing in the way of the regime's ambitions. Now, the ultimate goal was for the Chinese Communist Party to control all content on the global internet, all content on the global internet, controlled by the CCP. So the regime could wield what Xi described as, quote, discourse power over communications and discussions on the world stage. In other words, the CCP could control any discussion, right? Any outlet of information, control the global narrative, right? That's what he's talking about. She articulated a vision of, quote, using technology to rule the internet. And this was in order to achieve total control over every part of the online ecosystem. That includes over applications, over content, quality, capital, the money behind it, and even manpower, the individuals who are the influencers, the bottlenecks, the controllers of the internet. Now, his remarks were made at the fourth leadership meeting of the regime's top internet regulator, the Central Cyberspace Affairs Commission in Beijing on January 4th, 2017, recently leaked, but given in 2017, and detailed in internal documents issued by the Liaoning provincial government in China's southeast. The statements confirm efforts made by Beijing in the past few years to promote its own its own authoritarian version of the internet as a model for the world. Now, it continues a bit further on, and keep in mind, folks, the CCP's internet and its controls of the internet working as a model for the world. And we already see the paid internet trolls, the paid censors, the different systems they use to censor it being used by some private companies here in the US. Maybe not wholesale, maybe not the same type, maybe like the same technical technologies, but the same practices being used. We see this being used on social media right now. We see this being used in media narratives right now to target and control the online narrative. Now, it continues a bit further down in the story. To realize its ambitions, she emphasized the need to manage internet relations with the United States, while at the same time, quote, making preparations for fighting a hard war. In other words, Xi Jinping is saying in his own words, fighting a hard war, making preparations for fighting a hard war with the United States in the area of the internet, right? They regard this as war. American companies should be used by the regime to reach its goal, she said, without elaborating on how this would be done. He's talking about using American companies to reach this goal. And what American companies, folks, have we watched over the past four-ish years, working with the Chinese Communist Party, getting close to the Communist Party of China, and starting to replicate its own practices and narratives, right? You tell me. I'd say quite a few of them, quite a few, especially in the big tech and media arenas. Now, he didn't elaborate on this, but we can look for ourselves at companies that have gotten close to the CCP and started mimicking its narratives and practices. Now, he also directed the regime to increase its cooperation with Europe, with developing countries, and with member states of Beijing's Belt and Road Initiative. Any country that's in partnership with the Chinese Communist Party for the One Belt, One Road Initiative, right? In order to form a strategic counterbalance against the United States. That's the word he said, strategic counterbalance. Now, the article continues further down, saying that she ordered the regime to focus on three, quote, critical areas in its pursuit of controlling the global internet. First of these, it says Beijing needs to be able to set rules governing the international system. Second, it should install CCP surrogates in important positions in global internet organizations. What are the global internet organizations? And what individuals could be seen as CCP surrogates within those organizations? Now, keep in mind, that doesn't necessarily mean CCP leaders. That doesn't necessarily mean Chinese Communist Party members. That could mean people bought off or controlled or influenced by the Chinese Communist Party within key positions, right? Within those key positions. Now, the third of these, it says the regime should gain control over the infrastructure that underlies the internet, such as root servers, she said. If you gain control of root servers, you can control the, say, on or off switches, you could say, to different websites. Now, what has the Chinese Communist Party been doing to control the underlying technologies, the core technologies of the internet? Doing things, for example, like 5G, like with the One Belt, One Road Initiative, where it goes into countries and builds the internet infrastructure in these countries, right? They're doing this. Now, according to the documents, a bit further down the article, it says this, according to the documents, these leaked documents, she ordered the CCP to set up 3 ecosystems. And the 3 ecosystems he's defining here are technology, industry, and policy to develop core internet technologies. Having skilled workers was key to this plan, and with Xi directing that talent should be hired from around the globe. In other words, they're not just hiring Chinese, right? They're hiring people in foreign countries to carry this out. This would be done through Chinese companies, though, as Xi said. Now, he told Chinese firms to proactively invite foreign high-end talents to set up research centers overseas and hire leading ethnic Chinese and foreign specialists to work for them. Now, one of the programs the CCP uses to do this is the 1,000 Talents program. Another one is the Torch program, the 1,000 Talents program and the Torch program. And how many folks have we seen over the past four to 5 years? Remember, a lot of these people faced charges under Trump when the Trump administration was going after a lot of these individuals. How many different academics, how many different individuals, right, working at universities and so on, were found to have been working with the Torch program or the 1,000 Talents program, right? It's one of the things they do. Now, meanwhile, she asked the regime to set up a professional training system in China, which can systematically develop a highly skilled workforce in the long run. He also directed officials in each level of government to guide Chinese companies to develop their business plans to align with the regime's strategic goals. And we'll probably go into it tonight, but if we look at the way the CCP right now is going after a lot of the tech companies in the country, right? Alibaba, others, even some big players, it aligns with this. The CCP is bringing a lot of the companies in China more strongly under the control of the Chinese Communist Party. Remember, folks, around this same time was when the head of ByteDance, the company that runs TikTok, had to write his public, self-criticism letter stating, apologizing to the Communist Party and stating he would use his company going forward to more closely align with the CCP. Right? That was around this time that this was happening. We see more stuff happening with this. We've seen Alibaba get more deeply taken over by the CCP. Other companies get more deeply taken over by the CCP. This has been happening since then, right? It says it also was encouraging these companies, right? Encouraging capable enterprises to take the lead in developing innovations in core technologies. Enterprises were to be educated in having, quote, national awareness and safeguarding national interests. That means being aware of the interests of the Chinese Communist Party and safeguarding the interests of the Chinese Communist Party. Remember, in context of this, that's what the ByteDance CEO in his public letter apologized for not doing enough of and said he would do going forward, right? And it says only then should the regime support and encourage their expansion. And we saw as well after ByteDance did that apology, TikTok went global, right? Remember that? Now, because talent and critical technology are concentrated overseas, the Chinese leader Xi Jinping also ordered authorities to support the development of a group of multinational internet companies that can have global influence. In other words, building these companies overseas, it can look like an American company, look like a German company, but they're working with the Chinese Communist Party established by individuals through their networks on foreign soil. Now, Xi, in his 2016 speech before this, described all online content as falling into one of three categories: the red zone, a black zone, and the gray zone. Red zone content refers to discourse aligned with the CCP's propaganda requirements. Black zone material falls foul of these rules. Gray zone content lies in the middle. You're watching right now, I guess it would be considered a black zone material, right? We're criticizing the CCP here, which you can watch. Actually, Epoch Times has been criticized now by some shady-looking organizations for criticizing the CCP. And so we see this stuff appearing on the surface now, right? Media organizations using the narratives of the CCP to even try to silence us, which it's not going to work. And if you want to support us on standing up against that, again, check out epochtv.com. Now, on this, right, gray zone content lies in the middle. And Xi said this. He said, we must consolidate and expand the red zone and expand its influence in society. In other words, expand the CCP's control of information, ensuring that content online is in line with the CCP's narratives and the CCP's interests, right? And what does that mean? It means overtaking organizations that would criticize the CCP. Ironically, what a lot of these organizations are trying to attack Epoch Times for doing now, right? Now, Xi said this in a leaked speech in 2013. He said, we must consolidate and expand the red zone and expand its influence in society. He said, we must bravely enter into the black zone and fight hard to gradually get it to change its color. We must launch large-scale actions targeting the gray zone to accelerate its conversion to the red zone and prevent it from turning into the black zone. In other words, he's talking about global information warfare. Information warfare that is waging war, yes, as John Burt notes, things like Hollywood, waging war on things like media organizations, waging war on things like social media companies. And what have we seen the CCP do? Targeting media, targeting movies, targeting news outlets, targeting social media from 2013 up until now. Quite a bit, right? Quite a bit, folks. As I mentioned, United Front, CETC, been a lot of articles in National Pulse talking about how the CCP has been, through the United Front, inviting journalists on paid trips and how their content on the Communist Party reflects that. they start reporting favorably on them. How films in the film industry have been taken over by the Chinese Communist Party. How social media networks and some of their little proxy organizations have, been basically trying to kiss the boots of Communist Party leaders. And again, also enforcing some of the censorship policies the CCP is trying to enforce, attacking enemies of the Chinese Communist Party, people regarded as enemies of the Chinese Communist Party, in the same way the CCP would want to enforce that. We see even U.S. officials silencing themselves, censoring themselves, because they're afraid of offending the Chinese Communist Party. We see heads of our major companies afraid of criticizing the CCP. We see heads of state, for example, during the virus outbreak, afraid to call out the CCP. We saw, for example, the NBA, right, go under fire because one of the individuals there criticized the CCP, and then they shut down that individual, right? To what extent does the CCP control what can be said, good or bad, against it? Quite a bit, because just about every international institution, to an extent, has taken a side on this, right, between 2013 and now. And we've watched this play out now on the surface. Now, on this, inside China, the CCP has a stranglehold on online content and discussion through the Great Firewall, a massive internet censorship apparatus that blockades foreign websites and censors content deemed unacceptable to the party. It also hires a massive online troll army, dubbed the 50 Cent Army, to manipulate online discussion. You can find 50 Cent Army people in online chat groups, YouTube chats like here. You can find them on Facebook, Twitter, and so on. These, sock puppet accounts essentially run by the CCP, or just paid internet trolls. They'll get paid per post to write things that defend the interests of the CCP while attacking the enemies of the CCP. People deemed as enemies of the CCP, right? A recent report found that the CCP engages 2 million paid internet commentators. They hire 2 million individuals for this and draws in a network of 20 million part-time volunteers to carry out online trolling. Folks, 2 million paid individuals working for the CCP to go on internet chats, to go on online chats, to jump into, live chats like this one, and report or, do things favorably for the CCP, to defend the CCP, and to attack people called enemies of the CCP, to defend their narratives. And 20 million, also part of that network, carrying out these operations on Twitter, on Facebook, and elsewhere. So when you see some of these folks, you can get a decent idea of who they are. All right, folks, it's getting late, so let's call it a night on that. Folks, as always, I'll be doing these live Q&As every Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday. And so I'll see you again this coming Tuesday, 10:30 p.m. Eastern Time. And folks, also, we're doing a lot of content right now. I'm doing not just the Q&As, but also on Epoch TV. We have a lot of our interviews on there, and so please check that out as well. And again, if you really want to support us, please consider subscribing to Epoch TV, EPOCHTV.com. It's $4.99 a month, the price of a latte, or a bit less, I should say, than a gallon of gas in California in some places. We really would appreciate your support. If you want to go the extra mile as well, please consider telling a friend or a family member about Crossroads, telling them about Epoch TV. It really helps us, folks. That said, as always enjoyed doing these, folks. Appreciate all of you. Please take care of yourselves, stay informed, and stay free. Thank you.
Are we a white supremacist society? I mean, a white supremacist society would not have a African-American president and then an African-American vice president and then 3 out of the 5 billionaires in Hollywood African-American. It's one religion attacking another religion.
And so what you're saying is that it's promoted as a belief that you can't question, rather than, say, a philosophy or an idea that's up for debate and up for scrutiny.
What's the first thing these people did? 1776 does not exist. We're going to make up a number out of thin air with the first African American, and they had a whole sort of biblical Genesis type of new beginning of America. And then they said we're going to go through and wipe out all of the iconic statuary. This wokeism has to destroy our past. It has to convince people in the present that we control the past, and therefore the future is ours too. That's what Orwell said.